All right, we're still in part one, the ancient Middle East, circa 3500 BCE or before Common Era to 600 CE Common Era. Greece and Rome, circa 650 BCE to 400 CE. Greek civilization. Alexander the Great of Macedonia spread Greek influence, creating an empire that spanned from Greece and Egypt in the west to the western shores of the Indian Ocean in the east. After Alexander's death, Greek influence declined and the Romans' influence grew. However, the Greek art and wisdom continued to influence the world after its political power was overshadowed. Social organization. In the classical age, women remained in the home. Wives were responsible for running the household. Their days were spent tending to children, preparing meals, and creating clothing, including the spinning and weaving of fabrics. Upon going out in public, women were invisible. Most likely, women were expected to cover their face and neck with either their mantle or veil. Spartan women were less restricted. They were considered bold and they spoke openly. Priestesses had an equal status to that of men. Women must come from an affluent family in order to qualify to become a priestess. Religious dress was regulated by laws. White garments were required in the sanctuaries as they were seen as a symbol of purity. Priestesses were identified by the key to the sanctuary, which was a large, long, narrow piece of metal with a sharp, right angled turn. Often a circular garland hung from it. This key appeared to be universal. Fabrics and clothing production. Although other fibers such as silk and cotton were available from imports, most Greek clothing was produced from wool or linen. Greek clothing is mistaken to be white or have minimal color because most of the statues have been bleached white. But in reality, fabrics were dyed in colors and decorated during the weaving or embroidery process. Fabrics were likely woven to the exact size of the wearer, as Greek costume was draped and did not require cutting. Greek costume 600 to 100 BCE. The Greeks referred to the tunic as the chiton. This garment was depicted in earlier times as being sewn at the shoulders and under the arms. However, later versions were created by wrapping fabric around the body and securing it at the shoulders with one or more pins. Variations of the garment were created by belting the garment, by creating or manipulating the folds, and by placing the pins at different points on the shoulder. Chitons were worn to be full length but could be adjusted to fit the height of the wearer by adjusting the size of the overfold. Men and women wore cloaks and shawls that were either decorative or utilitarian over their chitons. Costume components for men and women. There were numerous changes that were made to the chiton over time. The Dora style chiton was abandoned because the Athenian women stabbed the messenger to death who delivered the news that almost the entire Athenian military was destroyed in battle. The iconic chiton superseded the Doris chiton. The hematon was largely worn amongst Greek men and women. This large rectangle piece of fabric was mostly commonly worn with the upper corner covering the left shoulder, with the bulk of the fabric wrapped around the back, passed under the right arm, and then draped over the left shoulder or carried across the left arm. During the Archaic period, the hematon was made from heavy wool with elaborate colored patterns, but during the Classical period, It was made of white or unbleached fabric. Its popularity may have been due to the ease in which the garment could be taken off and on for the purposes of sports. Other garments. The perizoma was worn by men as an undergarment or for athletic contestants. Women were shown wearing bands of fabric wrapped around their torso that is similar to the modern day sports bra. The diplex was a small rectangular piece of fabric that was worn by women over the ionic chiton. It was draped much like the hematin. The chlamydon was a more complicated version of the diplex. Fabric was pleated into a fabric band. In cooler weather, various styles of cloaks and capes were worn, the most prominent being the chlamys, a rectangular cloak of leather or wool pinned at the right or left shoulder. Typically worn by men during travel, the chlamys could be used as a blanket at night. Other garments continued. During the Archaic period, long or medium hair and beards were worn. During the Classical period, men had shorter hair but no beards for young men. Older men did have beards and they would also have longer hair. Men also wore fitted caps, petasos, phrygians, and pylos. For women, they wore their hair smoothly combed or in elaborate styles. In the Archaic period, they wore their hair long and with curls. In the Classical period, their hair was pulled back into a knot. Veils were also worn. Men and women both wore sandals. Men also wore fitted shoes and leather boots. Women often wore necklaces, earrings, rings, and decorative pins. Costume components for children. Infants were swaddled. Swaddling consisted of bands of fabric being wrapped around the body. Swaddling babies was a common practice throughout Europe into the 19th century. Its popularity has arisen in the US as a means to calm newborn babies and make them feel secure, much like the womb. Small boys were shown nude, while school-age boys wore short chitons that were either belted or unbelted. Girls' chitons were worn most like those of women and were belted in various ways. Both boys and girls wore hamadryons. Girls would wear their hamadryon over a chiton and boys would do the same or wear theirs alone. Small children and boys would wear their hair short. Older girls would wear their hair the same as women. Boys and girls would wear flat crown hats with heavy rolled brims. They often were barefooted. However, sandals and closed-toe shoes were worn at times. Earrings, necklaces, and bracelets were often worn. Typically, jewelry was in the form of animals that was often worn to provide protection. Costume for specialized occupations or occasions. The wedding dress. The wedding attire of the Greek bride was full of symbolism. The bride wore a Hercules knot on top of her wedding garment. The Hercules knot was loosened the night of the wedding as a symbol of and the preface to the sexual union. The bride also wore a veil with a bridal crown on top that was referred to as the Stephanie. The veil concealed the bride's face until the unveiling of the bride. Special sandals called nymphides were worn as well as elaborate jewelry, both the bride and the groom. As a symbol of her domestication, the bride presented the groom with a tunic, a chlamys she had woven. Costume for specialized occupation or occasions, military dress. Dress varied during the archaic and classical periods. Military costume varied from one city-state to the next, but usually included some form of protective clothing worn over a tunic. In the archaic period, soldiers wore cloaks made of rough wool, breastplates constructed of metal, or discs mounted to fabric corselets that were held up by the shoulder straps, worn as a form of protection. Helmets were made of leather or bronze with chin straps and high crests, intended to make the soldiers look more fearsome. Greaves made of leather or metal were also used to protect the legs. In the classical period, shoulders wore chlamys style cloaks with leather cuirass used to protect the body. Helmets were worn without crest or with crest. This may have included other pieces of protection that covered the cheekbones, nose, jaws, and neck. During both periods, men were either barefoot or they wore high boots. Costume for specialized occupations or occasions, theatrical dress. The importance of Greek theater led the way to traditional theatrical dress. Characters were identified by their traditional theatrical dress. Tragic masks were worn by tragic actors. Tall wigs of tufts or hair were attached. They also wore thick-soled platform shoes. All right, so this ties up the first part of chapter 3, Greece.